So the Greater Sydney region was chosen because it has one of the highest proportion of private renters of all Australian states and territories. Furthermore, when compared to other Australian capital cities, there is a high demand for private rental housing in Sydney, making Sydney one of the most expensive capital cities to rent. So this made the Sydney private rental sector during the time of the interviews particularly insecure. So since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been some regional variation in Australian rental markets. While some areas, particularly inner city areas such as Sydney, have an increased availability of properties and evidence of reduced demand, there appears to be a growing demand for private rental housing in urban fringe and regional areas. So the factors that are reshaping this demand in inner areas include short-term let properties. So for example, Airbnb being made available for long-term rental as a result of travel restrictions, temporary migrants, for example, international students and working holiday visa holders leaving the country, and young people moving back in with their parents due to loss of work. So outer areas, on the other hand, are booming as growing numbers of households are moving to these areas as they're able to work from home and they're seeking more space to work from home. So despite this, while circumstances surrounding the insecurity of private rental tenants in Australia may have changed when compared to the circumstances of my interview participants, the dimensions and experiences of private rental tenants, and in particular the limited security available to tenants, remains the same, although somewhat intensified some issues are intensified due to COVID. So my research findings are extremely useful in highlighting the everyday practices and experiences of private renters in Australia, and understanding the lived experiences of rental tenants is important for policy formation because it allows for an examination of the extent that current private rental policy fits the everyday experiences of private renters and ensures that future policy reform meets the needs of private renters. So in the remainder of this presentation, I will first provide an overview of the private rental sector as it is being experienced in Australia in response to COVID-19. I will then talk about how my own research helps to inform this data. And then lastly, I'll make some suggestions for policy responses that would create more security for private renters, both in Australia and in other homeowner societies. So in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept the world as people were forced to isolate within their homes, working from home and homeschooling children. Fundamental meanings of home have shifted. The pandemic has impacted the ways we operate within our homes, including the ways we use our homes and what we require to be comfortable. It has also reframed the importance of tackling housing insecurity and homelessness for governments who recognise the importance of housing to stop the spread of COVID. Higher rates of unemployment due to the COVID-19 pandemic and a lack of social housing are further intensifying the already insecure private rental sector in Australia. Most significantly, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the fore the limited security available to private rental tenants. In response to this insecurity, on the 29th of March 2020, so this was towards the beginning of the COVID pandemic in Australia, the Australian National Cabinet issued a 6-month moratorium on evictions for commercial and residential tenancies. In cases where tenants could prove financial hardship due to the pandemic, some Australian states, including New South Wales, have extended this moratorium. However, deferred payments and unemployment mean that once the moratorium is lifted, some tenants will be facing even worse circumstances, including eviction and/or debt. So a recently published study conducted by Bierre et al. Highlights some of the issues renters experience and may continue to experience as a result of COVID. So this data is from surveys conducted with 13,289 renting households nationally and comprises both private and public housing tenants. The surveys were conducted between July and August last year. And this research shows that the landlord-tenant negotiations around rent deferral that played out in response to the COVID pandemic differed markedly, and that tenants' experiences of security are shaped by this relationship. So as Bierre et al. Note, 1 in 3 respondents had requested or were planning to ask for a rent reduction or deferral. Notably, of those who had requested a rent change, 42% were granted a rent reduction, 17% entered into a rent deferral arrangement, but 30% had their request declined and 6% were still waiting to hear back. Later in the report, they state, where households had negotiated for changes to their rent due to hardship, these negotiations were necessarily piecemeal and highly dependent on individual circumstances, such as the existing relationship between tenant and landlord, the willingness of the tenant to request rent adjustments, the financial circumstances of both the tenant and landlord during COVID-19, and the presence of an agent in the negotiations. So it must be noted here that while tenants were more likely to try and negotiate a rent reduction with their property managers were actually less willing to grant rent reductions. Further extending on the landlord-tenant relationship and the potential for this relationship to create both rental security or rental insecurity, depending on the nature of this relationship, I will now turn to my PhD research. So for my research participants, feelings of housing insecurity and the inability to feel at home were experienced by those who felt they had a negative relationship with their landlord and or property manager. For example, participants who described situations where their landlord and or property manager had entered their home unannounced, landlords or property managers who had placed additional restrictions on participants' homemaking practices outside the confines of a standard lease agreement, and landlords and or property managers who refused or took ages to address issues with the rental property were described by participants as negatively affecting their ability to feel at home within their rental property. So, for example, one of my participants, who's been given the pseudonym Sonia, lives with her husband and daughter in a 2-bedroom apartment in Sutherland. So that's approximately 30 kilometres south of the Sydney CBD. And she told me that she asked permission from the landlord to get a wardrobe for her bedroom, and the landlord told her no because it would create dents in the carpet. He advised her to get something on wheels. So consequently, when I interviewed Sonia, she was storing her clothes on her bedroom floor. So while those practices and that request from a landlord is illegal, many of my participants were, and if they were to take their landlord to court, they would probably win and be allowed to have a covenant in their bedroom. Many of my participants experienced additional restrictions placed on them outside of the standard lease agreement, and in a high demand private rental sector such as Sydney at the time of the interviews and even now, participants are just not in a position to sort of many participants aren't in a position to take their landlord to court, unfortunately. So conversely, my participants described feeling more at home if they had a landlord or property manager who supported them to make their rental property feel like home. For example, tenants who had a landlord or property manager that would address their complaints in a timely manner, who were reachable, and who allowed them the freedom to exercise some autonomy over their dwelling by making changes, were described by tenants as positively impacting their ability to feel at home within their rental property. The property manager or landlord holds significant power over a tenant, shaping their ability or inability to feel a sense of home within their rental property and impacting their homemaking practices. As Lisa and Stephen, who rent with an additional roommate in Balmain East, about 3 kilometres west of the Sydney CBD state. She, their property manager, is not like unreachable, so she's not busy all the time. She's always there for us, which is quite good. Oh, sorry. Similarly, Diana rents a house from her partner's parents in Campbelltown, about 50 kilometres southwest of the Sydney CBD. So Diana's quote suggests her landlord places few restrictions on her homemaking practices, and this contributes positively to her sense of home. So the picture opposite Diana's quote is a picture of Diana's sliding glass door in her bedroom that her friend painted. During the interview, Diana stated that this painting makes her house feel homely, and Diana notes that she would not be allowed to do this in a normal rental property, even though the painting can be washed off. So my research suggests that landlords or property managers have the potential to profoundly affect the ways tenants experience home and their homemaking practices in 5 main ways. First, the extent to which tenants can feel relaxed and comfortable within their home. Second, tenants' ability to exercise autonomy over their dwelling. Third, this relationship allowed varying levels of privacy for the tenant. Fourth, this relationship was an important factor in how secure tenants felt about their occupancy. And last, the property manager appears to act as a gatekeeper to the private rental sector with significant power over a tenant's ability to secure a rental property in the first place. So during the search and application for a private rental property, tenants experienced varying degrees of lawful and unlawful discrimination, and this was revealed through my blog analysis. So for private rental tenants, meanings of home and homemaking practices extend beyond finding a suitable dwelling and making a home. Tenants also need to find a landlord or property manager who is supportive of the ways they make home. So what do tenants do if they can't establish a positive relationship with their landlord or property manager? So previous research suggests that tenants often move from their rental property if they have a negative relationship with their landlord or property manager. My research further supports this, but it also suggests that some renters preempt this concern in their preference for a shorter lease. So, for example, Chantel's quote highlights her reluctance to sign a long-term lease because she does not want to become stuck with limited autonomy over her dwelling. She discusses issues such as painting and pet ownership and her need for certainty that she could undertake these activities if in a long-term fixed lease. Participants were reluctant to sign a long-term lease because they did not know what their relationship with their landlord or property manager might be like. They were acutely aware that their ability to make a home and feel at home was dependent on this relationship, and this relationship varied greatly between rental properties. So while there is significant literature that discusses the housing insecurity private rental tenants experience, my research sought to understand tenants' agency in response to this insecurity. An unexpected and important finding was the ways private tenants use lease conditions as a mobile resource to exercise a degree of autonomy over their housing circumstances in response to the legal and structural insecurity within the private rental sector. So while previous research has told us that tenants often move out in response to multiple housing securities, including as they relate to housing access, housing condition, relationships with the landlord or property manager, a lack of consumer protection and housing affordability, my findings suggest that tenants mobilise the temporariness of short-term periodic leases as a resource, allowing them to move in response to other dimensions of housing insecurity. Tenants use short-term and periodic leases as a mobile resource, a way to exercise some agency over their housing circumstances, with the aim to secure more than just a roof over their heads, but a dwelling that meets their needs and desires, a home. However, lease conditions are also, short-term leases are also a contradictory resource in this respect, because they act as both the forms of security and insecurity for tenants. So signing a 6-month lease might allow a tenant to trial a rental property and see what their relationship with their landlord might be like, see what the condition of the property might truly be like, but it also adds that, it also means that they're not signing a longer term lease and getting that long-term security. So, yeah. Okay, so consumer protections, including the right for tenants to make a home, the right for tenants to move when they need to, availability of affordable housing that caters to a diversity of household demographics, and appropriate structures designed to assist tenants in protecting and enforcing their rights in the event of non-compliance and disputes are important measures to enhance rental security. Currently, Australian rental policy protects the rights of the landlord over the rights of the tenant. This is often tied up in dominant ideology in many homeowner societies, which associate meanings of home with ownership. Currently, tenancy regulation considers the right of the landlord to use their investment property as they wish, including to sell their investment quickly if they need to, as opposed to the right of the tenant to establish security over their housing circumstances and make a home. In order to create more security for tenants, lease provisions must take a bottom-up and not a top-down approach. Changes to tenancy regulation must be informed by the negative impact dominant ideologies that link concepts of home to the tenure of home ownership have on private rental tenants. There is a vast difference between a house and a home. Considering the need for homes and the critical values that are associated with home as opposed to simply housing is a useful reframing of these values. Social distancing and social isolation require people to have access to safe and secure housing that meets their needs and requirements. The need to understand the ways private tenants experience insecurity and the ways they understand and make a home within the context of rental insecurity has become increasingly pertinent within the context of COVID. The landlord-tenant relationship is central to tenants' experiences of their rental insecurity and shows the lack of policy in Australia with regards to protecting tenants within this relationship. So, thank you. That's it.
Thanks so much, Bronwyn. Fascinating stuff, and also very timely, very good timekeeping. So I really appreciate that. We have a few minutes now to see if we have some questions from our audience. I'll just see if any come in. There's a Q&A function down at the bottom of your screens. Just to answer one question that came in on the chat function, the session is being recorded, although I pressed the record button a little bit late, and we'll make it available after the session, and I'll ask the panelists afterwards as well about making the PowerPoint slides available too. I might just ask a question, Bronwyn, in the meantime, about more so the COVID-19 pandemic, and to what extent we have an understanding of how the additional security of tenure afforded to tenants during the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact. I know you mentioned eviction moratoriums, and yeah, to what extent that has changed, for example, the experience of home.
So, sorry, just to clarify, so how much has the moratorium on evictions changed the experience of home for tenants?
Yeah, the experience of home, or the issue of insecurity in general. Now, I know your research focused on an earlier period, but I was just wondering if there was any evidence in relation to that.
So what the research that is, what the stuff that's slowly feeding in has found is that for example, I do some volunteer work for the Tenants Union of New South Wales, and so their biggest concern is that the moratorium on evictions is only creating tenure security for a certain period of time, and particularly if tenants have chosen to not, like if they're unable to negotiate a rent reduction, they're basically building up their rent over that 6-month period where the moratorium evictions is on, and then they've got to pay that debt back. So it's creating temporary security for a really, really short period of time, and then increased insecurity again.
Yeah. Thanks, Bronwyn. Yeah, I'm actually doing qualitative interviews at the moment with tenants, just at the very early stage of a project here in Ireland. I'm finding that's something that tenants are voicing as well. There's a kind of ambivalence or ambiguity there, because sooner or later, the perception is the moratorium will end. I have a question. I think we have 2 questions. One from Peter Kemp. Hi, Peter. Does no-fault eviction exist in Australia? And if so, does this explain why tenants are reluctant to enforce their rights?
Yeah, so we have no grounds evictions in certain states. So Melbourne has just, for example, so January 2021, they've abolished no grounds evictions, and I believe Tasmania doesn't have no grounds evictions, but certainly when my tenants were interviewed, there was definitely no grounds evictions. So yeah.
And did you find in your research that impacted tenants in terms of their ability to I think advocate for themselves or enforce their rights, as Peter put it?
Yep, definitely. But I also think that just purely the demand for private rental properties was a big factor. So even if a tenant is to advocate for their rights, there might not be another rental property that they can, if they need to leave, to go into and things like that. But at the same time, it was quite interesting because a lot of my participants wanted those short-term leases because they often saw them as a way to trial out a rental property and see how things go. And so so for example, 2 of my participants signed leases where they didn't have a phone line in their rental property, and they just assumed that every rental property has phone lines. And so this wasn't something, moving is a big process, and so it wasn't something that they could just leave. They had to deal with it once they moved in. One of them paid $250, had a phone line installed into their rental property to deal with these issues. And so tenants often don't know what they're getting into. They don't know what their relationship with their landlord's going to be like. They don't exactly know the condition of the property. They're going in for 3 seconds to quickly inspect something with another 20 people. And so they're not wanting to sign these really, really long-term leases. So it's this idea of security is quite interesting as well around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And there's a related question from Tina McVeigh, very closely related to the last question. Do you find many tenants face eviction after taking landlords or agents to courts?
I think it's more that they sometimes the relationship can't be repaired, and so there is research that talks about tenants after they've taken their landlord to court, they have wanted to move out. Sometimes, so one of my participants, it was actually the condition of the rental property was so severe. There was a flooding issue that so she had to move out straight away, but the landlord wasn't compensating her for that. And so in that situation, she took her landlord to court, but she'd already left the rental property. But definitely, yes, once tenants take their landlord to court, they definitely may run the risk of being evicted for other reasons, and especially when you have no grounds evictions, that's a real fear and a real concern.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I'm going to take one more question before we move on to the next paper. We've actually got loads of questions coming in, so I'll get to one more now, and then we'll hopefully get to some of the others at the very end when we have more time for discussion. Paddy Gray asks about do you have expectations of behavioral changes in terms of where people want to live post-COVID, for example, in relation to private space?
So there's research around, as I was saying, people wanting to move away from inner city areas to outer regional Australia in terms of the actual dwelling itself and having more private space. I've not seen research yet around housing preferences in that respect. And it could just be that there's just a lack of options in terms of dwellings for private renters in Australia anyway. It's sort of get what you can afford as quickly as possible. But definitely, so I live in Wollongong, and I think when prior to COVID, so which is an hour and a half from the Sydney CBD, and prior to COVID, I think rental vacancy rates were about 2%, and now they're down to under 1%. So it's definitely, and I'm sure you've maybe heard on the news things about Bierre, which is quite popular in a town in Australia. So that's just been inundated now.
Yeah. Thanks, Bronwyn. It's similar there's the data that we have about rent increases in Ireland suggests a similar pattern, and it is a little bit concerning where maybe parts of the country or suburban or regional contexts where tenants on lower incomes may have been forced due to the unaffordability of rents in more central areas. Those regions themselves might come under more pressure in terms of rental price growth, which would be concerning. Thanks so much, Bronwyn, and thanks for all the questions. As I say, there's quite a few more, but we hopefully will have a chance to get back to them after our next two papers. So thanks again, Bronwyn. And at this stage, I'd like to bring in our next two presenters. So our next presentation is from Dr. Bridgette Toy-Cronin and Dr. Sarah Bierre, who'll be presenting together on the tribunal tribunal hearings system. If it's okay, I'll hand over to you both. I think, Sarah, you're going to share the screen for this one.
Yeah, I'll give that a go. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Right, is that working for everyone?
Yeah, looks great.
Great. So Bridgette and I are going to speak together, as Michael has said, and I'll start off. There we go. So I thought we'd cover first New Zealand's response to the pandemic and also set the context in terms of the housing crisis that is happening in New Zealand, which it sounds like it's the same old story as Australia and many other parts of the world are going through at the moment. And then we'll look at our research, which has looked at the use of discretion in our tenancy tribunal and mediation system, particularly around rent arrears cases and deciding on whether or not to evict a tenant. And Bridgette will cover the results of that work. And then I'll look at putting this in the context of the pandemic again and the housing crisis, and sort of look at how this has impacted on how our tribunal system is working, and also what we see as the future of a more just tribunal system. So New Zealand has undertaken what has been termed a hard and fast strategy of elimination in terms of dealing with COVID-19. We quite quickly shut the borders, and at the end of March went into a lockdown for around 6 weeks, and that was pretty strict. So I think supermarkets and petrol stations were open, but otherwise it was all shut. So there was a lot of concern around how this would affect households, particularly in terms of losing income and how this could threaten security of tenure and people losing their tenancies. So as was the case in other countries, we introduced a moratorium on eviction, which was to last for 3 months. There was also a restriction on rent rises. And there was an anticipation of a great recession and falling house prices. The government also decided to lift loan to value ratio restrictions, which had been put in place to stop overinvestment by landlords in the private rental sector. So this was to keep house prices at a tolerable level. So what resulted was actually quite different. So this graph shows how at the end of May, house prices shot up. So the lifting of those loan to value ratio restrictions had quite a considerable impact. So a lot of this investment in housing was from first home buyers, but a lot of it was also from property investors. And there has been a lot of media attention paid to this and a lot of pressure on the government to do something about it. Less attention was paid to rents, of course, because we are a home owning society, although in New Zealand we have reached a point where half of people are renting, which is we have the lowest rate of home ownership in about 70 years. So rents, because we had the 6-month rent restriction, those stayed quite static, but when that ended, they also shot up. And in quite a short period of time, people had quite significant rent increases and not a comparable increase in income. Our public housing register, so our social housing, which is owned by the government, has continued to increase. And after lockdown ended, this increased a little bit more steeply, but it has been an issue for quite a while, the undersupply of social housing. This graph is quite interesting because I think it shows who has borne the brunt of COVID and our housing crisis. So in the last 3 parts of the graph here, you can see how the emergency housing spend has jumped quite a lot since we had our lockdown. And this is a grant which is given to people who are essentially housed in motels. And most of these people will be people who've been evicted from private rental housing because we have a no eviction policy in our public housing. So there is a sustainable tenancies policy, which has kind of been tentatively adopted by our government. And this is rolled out as sort of a wraparound system around tenants who have a vulnerable tenancy. So Bridgette and I decided to look at how our legal system supports this idea of sustaining tenancies rather than having rapid evictions. So our tenancy tribunal system was established under the Residential Tenancies Act. It was modelled on the design of a tenancy system in Victoria and Australia. And it was designed for the swift and simple resolution of tenancy disputes and designed to enable a swift eviction procedure, particularly for tenants who haven't paid the rent. So we have a tenancy tribunal and a mediation system. So most cases initially will go to mediation. So our research question was to look at how instances of rent arrears were dealt with in the tribunal and mediation system. So we were particularly interested in how they applied clauses in the law or sections of the law that allowed them to show discretion. We used Luke's 3 dimensions of power, Steve Luke's, and we go into that a bit more in our paper, but we looked at who wins, so the first dimension of power. And in New Zealand, it's mostly landlords who are bringing cases, around 85%, and the majority of those cases are won by landlords. We looked at the second dimension of power in the law, so what arguments are permissible and who sets the agenda and what sort of arguments can be made during a tribunal hearing. And then finally, we looked at the third dimension of power. So what outcomes are considered normal and accepted and naturalized? So what sort of consequences of rent arrears do we accept? So I'll hand over to Bridgette.
Hi, so I'm just going to pick up talking briefly about the legal framework. So as Sarah said, it's the Residential Tenancies Act. And where there's rent arrears, it's just 21 days at the time that the landlord files. If they can prove there are 21 days of arrears owing, and it's mandatory termination. So the tribunal is required to terminate the lease. The only kind of out clause from that is section 55(1) capital A, which allows for a conditional termination. So it's still a termination, but it's on conditions, basically a payment plan that can be put in place if the tribunal is satisfied that the tenant can pay the arrears for that payment plan until they're paid off and is unlikely to commit a further breach. So that's the legal background. So the study that Sarah and I conducted was in 2 parts. So Sarah did a randomized analysis of the randomly chose a week, which turned out to be December the 4th to the 8th, 2017, and looked at orders which were made by the tribunal. These are available on a public register for 3 years, so they can be viewed by anyone, which is important because they contain the names of tenants and landlords. So Sarah did an analysis of those, and I did the observations of mediations and tribunal hearings. So mediations are conducted almost exclusively by phone, although there are a few in person, but all of the ones that I observed were by phone. And they lasted an average of 23 minutes. And then I also observed 31 tribunal hearings, which lasted about 40 minutes each. So this is the basis of our study. The conditional orders, which is that section 55(1) capital A, we found from Sarah's analysis, used very rarely. Only 20% of cases that she examined actually used that clause. So usually, if you get as far as the tribunal, the tenancy is over if you've got 21 days of arrears there. So the mediation service is where where cases go initially. So most of them are funneled to mediation first. And the data we've got on mediations is only from the observations because they are confidential. So the mediator at the end creates an order from the mediation, which is then sealed by the court as if it had been made by the tribunal. So it circumvents the tribunal completely, and if it can be enforced without any further legal process. Mediation, if you're familiar with dispute resolution processes, is very much based on the idea that it's a consensual agreement. And this was how all the mediations were introduced, that it's a voluntary and consensual process. I was somewhat surprised by how the mediations ran, just because in mediations, a more traditional idea of mediation is that you've got a lot of room for discussion and a lot of everything can kind of be brought to the table. This was quite a different environment. So one aspect of it, which we looked at through the Luke's lens about power, is how much power was actually given to the landlord in these. And that came from external factors, not just how it was conducted, but because if the tenant then goes on to the tribunal, if no agreement's reached, their name becomes published, and then there's these landlord groups who are making lists of tenants who have been to the tribunal, whether as an applicant or as a respondent, and so that then affects their ability to go on and get another tenancy. And some of the mediators, in fact, introduced the mediation saying, you know, this is your kind of last chance not to have your name published, as a warning, or could be read as a threat, I guess. The other problem for tenants is that because of that very limited discretion that's allowed in the law with the conditional orders, it is true that it's very risky for a tenant to go on to the tribunal because their name will be published and they're likely to lose their tenancy. The other issue is how the mediation was conducted, is that, as I alluded to, the issues were quite confined about what the mediator would allow to be talked about. So Sarah, if you can just flip to the next slide. This is just an example of a tenant who was talking during the mediation about the fact that she'd moved into this property which wasn't actually finished. And she talked about there was no kitchen, blocked toilets, drains are buggered. The plumber told us yesterday one room's not insulated and another room's just jibbed, so no finishing, and I'm pregnant and I'm sick. And the mediator was concerned about these issues, but wouldn't let the tenant discuss them in the mediation unless she actually filed a cross application. And this was in an environment where there's very restricted housing. So it was, I don't know what happened in the end, but it was highly unlikely that the tenant would actually do so because she'd be likely to lose her tenancy. So that was some of the observations from the mediations. And then if we go through to the tribunal itself, which is where people end up if they can't settle it, mediation, or if they more likely don't attend mediation. So some of the findings from this was that, as I said, there is this possibility to use conditional orders to sustain the tenancy. It's, you know, the last ditch effort to have a payment plan put in place to hand back the tenancy. But what we found was that there was a lot of informal rules operating within the tribunal, which was actually restricting the use of this, this power of the tribunal. A high evidence threshold, informal rule that the tenant had to be there, decision making that was given over to the landlord rather than taken by the tribunal, and quite a few cases where section 55 capital A was just ignored completely, like it talked about, not talked about as if it didn't exist. So Sarah, if you flip, yeah, this is one of the examples of a high evidence threshold. So the difficulty, if you recall from the conditional order, has to be that they have to prove that they're not going to go back into arrears and that they can pay it off, which is very difficult in the circumstances that people were presenting with, you know, people living in poverty with really unstable personal circumstances, to be able to bring evidence to the tribunal that they're not going to go back into debt is a pretty difficult thing to do. But even then we found that opportunities weren't necessarily given. So we've got a MSD, there is our Ministry of Social Development. We have an agency where people can go and get a loan to cover arrears or enter into a payment plan, but there was no really clear link up between those services. And so, for example, this one, the adjudicator and the Tenancy Tribunal is saying, I've got no option but to terminate the tenancy prior to Christmas without having that opportunity to go and try and present that evidence. Related to this is an informal rule that the tenant must attend for that section 55(1)(a) order to be made. And this probably relates to the fact that you need evidence. So, you know, the obvious person to bring the evidence about the ability to pay is the tenant. But the law doesn't actually require that the tenant bring that evidence. So you can draw it from lots of places. It could be that they've been making payments, for example. But we found that even that wasn't necessarily enough. There was this informal rule operating that if the tenant wasn't there, then no conditional order would be made. As this quote shows, I must terminate the tenancy. That is the case, even though the tenant has reduced the amount, so the arrears are being paid off. Because she did not attend, I could not consider whether to make a conditional termination order. We also noted that some of this is a signalling that's being taken from the tenant not being there. So tenants, as I'm sure is common in many jurisdictions, attended in very low numbers, but their absence was read sometimes by the adjudicator as having meaning beyond that, that they weren't interested and you know, they weren't going to be part of it. And then the last thing we observed was just that often the adjudicators would hand the decision-making power over to the landlord. So the power that's in the statute belongs to the adjudicator, but the adjudicators were treating it as if it was the landlord's choice, basically. So this is the type of language that we found in different circumstances. You know, the landlord chose to allow the tenant, didn't want to consider a conditional order. So in fact, the tribunal process is being used in a way which is even further supporting landlord power. And it's against this background of how the system's operating that we have concerns about what's now happened in the rental market that Sarah will talk about now in the post-COVID world, and how this is going to exacerbate some of these problems.
Yeah, so this is a quick graph which shows what happened when we lifted the eviction moratorium. So the government...
Sorry, Sarah, just around 3 minutes left, if that's okay.
The government lifted the moratorium at the end of June. So during the moratorium, there was still 1,000 evictions through the Tenancy Tribunal. So it was a drop, but there was still 1,000 that occurred. And then after the moratorium lifted, we had expected that there would be a big jump, but there wasn't. It didn't go up to pre-COVID levels. It has sat at around 2,000 and sort of stabilised at that level. And rent arrears cases have also stayed low. So about 90% of termination applications are for rent arrears. There's lots of theories about why this is. Some say that tenants are being more careful with their rent, if that's possible, because the market is so tight. During COVID and the lockdown, there was a very strong government discourse about being kind, and this sort of goes back to that informal relationship between landlords and tenants, and the idea that this kindness was reflected at a time of crisis also in that relationship. So this is a mediator that was interviewed and saw that property management companies who might have usually been quick to evict tenants said, okay, let's work together and try and get a payment plan rather than jumping straight to an eviction. We don't really know exactly what's going on though. So just as our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who is widely praised for her approach to COVID, but hasn't been quite so widely praised for her approach to the housing crisis and the housing problems happening at the moment. So just quickly to finish, we think that there's an opportunity for intervention when a tenant presents at the tribunal or the mediation in rent arrears. we think that they should be supported to attend hearings. Phone hearings were trialled during COVID, and this is we think this is a good opportunity to extend this to all tenancy tribunal hearings. There's MS loans from our social welfare agency that could be accessed, and the sustaining tenancies program, which is quite limited at the moment, could be rolled out more widely, although this would require a lot more funding. We think a conditional termination order should always be considered, and finally, rent arrears cases should always be adjudicated, because it's not really a question, it's not something you can mediate whether or not they've paid rent. It's usually more around whether they're able to repay the rent and get on top of the arrears. So yeah, thank you. I'll end there. Stop this year.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Bridgette, for a fascinating presentation. Lots to talk about there, and we do have some questions coming in already, specifically for your presentation. So the first is from Finn Toland. Hi, Finn. He asks, how common is it for either party to have professional legal representation at a tribunal hearing? So I don't know if either or both of you would like to respond.
Under the statute, representation is not permitted unless there's some very limited circumstances. It have to be at least $7,000 in arrears, I think. And even then, they don't always give it. Landlords often have property managers who have lots of experience in the tribunal. So there is inequality in representation in that sense. But lawyers, very limited involvement. Most lawyers don't know what happens in the tribunal at all.
Thanks, Bridgette. We've another question here from Chris Foy, who says, fascinating stuff. Was there any difference in how small versus large landlords navigated or were treated by the tribunal system? And the kind of context for the question is that there is a common argument in the UK that we should have more large landlords to professionalise the PRS. But is there a concern that this would exacerbate the power imbalance for larger landlords?
Yeah, I think that obviously social housing landlords for a while were quite before we had our sustainable tenancies policy, we're using the tribunal a lot. So I think that would definitely increase the power imbalance if there were large landlords who were used to going through the tribunal system. I don't know.
Yeah, I've done a follow-up. It's not part of this paper, but I've interviewed adjudicators and mediators subsequently and talked a bit about representation and the idea of, professionalizing the at least the landlord side. And there's sort of arguments on both sides because there's good and bad aspects to both of it, of having just, your everyday people coming in and keeping it a very impersonal, and then the complexity of the legislation. And it sort of comes down to this idea of sort of bad property managers and or good property managers and all those sorts of things. Sarah knows lots about the good and bad tenant argument, that kind of, so it's unclear, I think, about what would be better, but there's certainly in New Zealand a strong feeling generally that we want to keep it very informal. It's meant to be very kind of in person.
Thanks both. May I just ask a kind of a follow-up question there on that point, Bridgette? I wonder just if you could say a bit more about the, I suppose, the background to the nature of the tribunal process and the adjudication process, and what is the rationale for maintaining a more informal type process, and also to what extent is the scope for what tribunals can determine limited by the legislation? So, to what extent are their hands tied by the legislation? What's the scope for the tribunal hearing itself to determine different types of outcomes?
So one of this project's part of a larger project. We're a bigger team, and we've got a historian on our team as well, Ben Schrader, who's written a paper about the background of the Tenancy Tribunal and how it came to be. So that will probably be of interest to you when that's published. The idea of it being informal was basically to keep lawyers out, to keep costs down and make it fast and accessible, sort of an idea of, I guess, based around, mum and dad investors and the tenant. So it's sort of based on that model, which of course is under tension as you've got people accumulating large numbers of properties. The tribunal can make any decisions with, so their jurisdiction is the Residential Tenancies Act, and it does have discretion within it. Not huge amounts, but there's definitely discretion. And so, you know, part of what we were looking at was how that was being exercised and finding that it's often being read down further than what would be required. I mean, one of the issues is that tenancy adjudicators are just paid a day rate and they're not part of the judiciary and they don't have many protections. So we've got quite a few of these things in New Zealand, which are kind of attachments to our main legal system, and they have a really sort of constitutionally uncomfortable position, and they're not very protected or as independent as the judiciary. So there's lots of kind of tensions around it, but it's I guess generally in line with our culture of wanting sort of relationship-based, fast, quick solutions to things.
Thanks very much, Bridgette. And indeed, Sarah, great paper. There were a few more questions there, again, that we didn't have a chance to get to just yet, but as I've mentioned, we have some time towards the end where we can return to some of those questions. So there'll be lots to talk about there. So yeah, a wonderful paper. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Adriana Soaita, who will be speaking on the paper entitled "For a Post-COVID World, Private Tenants Demand a Right to Housing." So I'll hand over to you, Adriana. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mick. Thank you for inviting me here. Hopefully my presentation will bring a touch of hope compared to Bridgette quite dark insights from Australian Tribunal. At the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, I conducted a project on private tenants activism. And two outputs are on the way. One is a cash report, which explored private tenant renting experiences during the COVID pandemic. Data was collected between October-December 2020. I look in this report at property suitability to COVID lockdown in terms of location, property quality, space, noise. I look at the changing sense of home of tenants, of the rising issue of social isolation, and the really worrying trends of affordability, given new affordability stressors due to COVID. The second output, hopefully an article, documents the policy demands that private tenants make to the government, and I want to focus on this today. There is an assumption linking the two that tenant housing experiences will maybe steer them into activists, but surely they will frame their demand. And today I want to touch on three questions. Why and in what ways do private tenants engage in activism? The question of collective representation and what are their demands to the government. Just briefly, I would mention that my view of activism is inspired by Chatterton and Pickeril's nuanced view of everyday activism. Everyday activism goes beyond simple militant action, privileges doing activism rather than being an activist, through muted acts of resisting capitalism to build that hoped for future into the present, brick by brick. And correspondingly, I understood tenant activist agency or tenant activist engagement as any act such as signing a petition, making a complaint to or against the landlord, joining a tenant organization, picketing, taking to the street, with the belief, and that's important, that one's action may improve the sector for all. My methodological approach was an online questionnaire. Would I describe it better as a written interview? a short questionnaire with 11 open-ended mandatory questions. And of course, I took a risk by taking this open-ended approach, but it was surprisingly successful. 60 participants took part and they gave rich data. I had 4 questions on the housing experiences of tenants, and I give here an example. Has your rented property and its location been comfortable for a stay-at-home policy? With explanatory text, for instance, you may comment on the availability and quality of space, privacy, access to green space, shopping and exercising, and whether your perception of the quality of the accommodation changed during the lockdown. I had 6 questions on tenant activism. And here is the first in the series. Please tell us about your experience of tenant activism in as much detail as you wish. For instance, we would like to know what you did, when, with whom, what caused you to become involved, and what you hope to achieve. Overall, have you enjoyed doing it, or has been a stressful experience? And the numbers on the right side are a word count, just to give you a glimpse of the richness of data. Responses came mostly from southeast of England and Scottish Central Belt, which are under pressured housing market. In terms, the sample had variability in terms of age group, household type, financial situation. Overall, however, the sample was urban, females were overrepresented, and just 1 participant was a key worker. 4 were shielding. You notice that my definition of activist was quite open, but participants did not self-select into the study for trivial action. Many engaged in collective actions. They were members of tenant unions, even setting up new local branches. They initiated their own petition. And also many engage in individual action, taking landlord to the court, complaining to the councils, addressing their MPs or media. So I said that I asked them why they engage and what they hope to achieve, and their reasons and aims indeed tied in well with Chatterton and Pickeril's view. They indeed wanted to improve the sector brick by brick, for instance, by setting an example to other landlords, by improving the situation in a specific tenancy for the next tenant. And it was a clear and not surprising tension between short-term and long-term aims, between helping as many tenants as possible now, particularly that COVID-19 emergency measures are coming to an end, and between the long term of raising awareness, increasing pressure to change laws and policies to a fair system for all, away from this mafia system where only profit and abuse count. So in terms of how their experiences felt, many indeed said that it was a stressful but also cathartic experience, as you can see in the first quotation, and others mention it using different words. Commonly, participants got a sense of empowering, a sense of belonging, a sense of not being alone anymore. And the broader literature says that such positive experiences of engagement, even if stressful, steer people into further action. And indeed, over the COVID year, the membership in tenant union doubled, and also their tenant support groups doubled during this period. And I expect that will happen in the future as well. There were, however, 2 participants who felt that tenants were so powerless and their resources so small that they can't really make a change, and they consider their experience to be a waste of time. I thought it's important to understand the question of representation, the fact that it was answered through self-representation. Only tenant unions and individual tenants have the right to be entitled to speak in the name of tenants. Other organizations were recognized as useful, for instance, shelter for legal advice, local councils for enforcement, the Green Party and the Labour Party as political allies. However, the right of representation remain of tenants alone. And they consider, participants consider that their voices should be heard and included in policy making, not only because this is a democratic right, but because the matter of regulating the private rental sector is one of contention, because the tenant-landlord relationship is so unequal, because government privilege property owners, as Bridgette's presentation so terribly showed, and because, of course, UK is a landlord democracy, participant says, if you count the number of landlords in the parliament. So interestingly, participants not only stated their demands, but they also deliberated on the entry points for policy change. And a couple of participants claimed their consumer rights. They pay exorbitant rents, so they have the right to a fit-for-purpose service. Here, it was mentioned legal equivalence to a commercial tenancy, when you can have a very long-term rental with the option to be fully in control of the interior of the house. And this shows that a long-term secure tenancy with tenant control, it's not alien to the UK regulatory landscape. However, I must say that most other participants did not believe in the power of their consumer rights. Estates and letting agents have the audacity to tell the tenants who are paying their wages that their client is the landlord, not the tenant. Many more participants, of course, refer to the right to home. Their right to live as in a home in the property, regardless who owns it. And here, participants talked about regulatory equivalence to social housing and even to home ownership, part disposal, which we know would shock landlords in the UK, but we know that similar regulatory system exists in European, continental Europe. Some participants also refer to a broader and stronger right, the right to live in a fair economic system and in a fair society, and I call that the right to social justice. The UK, it's very much engrossed in upstairs, downstairs thinking, class divide, the have-nots, giving the haves privileges. UK should be more socially advanced instead of believing in total hardcore capitalism. And here there were clear references to the Scandinavian countries and Germany. So I got to policy demands. I quantified the number of participants who referred to a policy with or without further specifics. And I present them here in ranked order. And not surprisingly, the most important two were rent control and tenure stability, as well as flexibility. And I would like to emphasize that tenants' demands for rent control were more radical than the current one implemented in Ireland or those discussed in Scotland, because they pay high rents, they ask even for reduction, for freezes, for caps, but caps further adjusted to property quality, to local wages, to equivalent local mortgages. And how sad that yesterday, I think in Germany, the Berlin rent freeze was considered illegal. In terms of tenure stability, participants ask for tighter clauses for eviction to be banned in certain conditions, for instance, during the winter or for a rent increase. But participants also ask for flexibility. Being trapped for 6 months somewhere where you want to leave is horrible. And indeed, during the COVID pandemic, the governments of many countries have taken measure against eviction, but the issue of flexibility received no attention. Even so, for instance, that was a big issue in the UK in relation to students who returned to their parental home, but they were still forced to pay their rents. In my research, this was an issue for 10 participants who moved to better quality housing, and also for many others whose income decreased because of furlough or reduced hours or unemployment, and they were trapped in expensive properties. The following 3 demands refer to home materialities, and I will not discuss personalization, which is so important, and Proe mentioned in her presentation, pet ownership, which also came strongly. I want to direct your attention to property quality of repairs. Participants really wanted standards, not only for decent quality, but indeed for livable quality standards, to go down up to the quality of furniture. Not being able to have a wardrobe in the room, I found that terrible. And even to the quality of the defining walls in an HMO. And again, many ask for regulatory rules for repairs. We know that a state of disrepair affects tenants' well-being and health, and participants ask for quick deadlines and key for rent reductions for periods of disrepair. So far, I already mentioned regulation. Participants ask for finely grained and a strong regulatory approach, cast in law, not just in recommendation. And I read this quotation for you. The neighbor's landlord talked to me about doing repairs out of the goodness of his heart. The fact that landlords can see themselves in this light, it's why we need detailed regulation to frame landlords' duties. And indeed, if you look at the line 9, participants ask a series of measures that would curtail landlord power. Participants, and let's remember, these were participants who considered to be engaged in activism, consider themselves to be the best guardians for landlord compliance. They know how the property is and how the landlord behaves, but they also ask for support in disputes, non-court as well as court. However, remember, 3 participants were taking their landlords to the court. There were some other demands, broader. They show ways to go away from the asset economy, for instance, by tackling house price growth and speculation, by progressive wealth taxation, by enacting right to buy in the PRS, by implementing living wage, a better welfare system, a reliable pension system, and all these connect with that broader right that I talked, the right to social justice. And I let you read this quotation that shows that this right to social housing has to be extended to humans and non-humans by moving towards an environmentally sustainable economic system. So I think few of us here would disagree with this quotation. To conclude now, I want to policy recommendation because the whole point was that participants made them thoughtfully and eloquently. Hesitancy to act in fear that landlords will sell up is pathetic. Landlords exit, the houses remain. Other participants argue that we only need long-term landlords in the market. I asked them, do you think that will be possible? And I would say the picture was one of pessimism with a touch of hope. Yes, if we continue to push for it and continue to speak up, and however, no, if our governments have anything to do with it. They don't care. They're often landlords themselves. And just a final word on this method of the online written interview. It was successful in collecting data of breadth and depth with minimal resources, which is so important for researchers now in this, at least in the UK, reduced research funding environment. I consider that it's closer to structured interview. It allows for content analysis. But indeed, it requires participant effort more than a normal questionnaire and less than an interview, and therefore requires participant interest. And like in any online research, there is the issue of digital exclusion. I already mentioned that the sample was urban, but that may also be a feature of urbanism, of activism being more frequent in urban area besides digital exclusion. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Adriana. Fascinating presentation there, and really interesting to see the probably maybe the kind of first iteration of this very recent research project, or the data being presented. So I really appreciate that. And we'll take a few minutes for questions specifically for Adriana, and then we'll open it up again and have more of a general discussion, I suppose. And we've two questions have come in already for you, Adriana. The first is about the role local authorities have to play with resolving the inequality between landlords and tenants and enforcement. How can their role be improved? And that's from Lydia Reid. Thanks, Lydia.
Yeah, I must say that local councils were seen as useful organization by the tenant, but by no means fully pro tenant. So there is a role for local council in supporting tenants, because tenants are open, as you notice, to make complaints, against their landlords there, and to welcome help. But unfortunately, I would say that the power of local council has been more and more curtailed. There are less and less resources at the moment to help tenants. So that's why this activist movement, it's growing so that tenants can help themselves. And yesterday at the Housing Study Association, I heard a presentation of tenants in the 1920s and 30s, and the method they use, and actually there were the same type of methods that activists use now, like fighting a landlord by lots of phone calls so he could not rent another property, or by flooding the landlord with visits so that again he could not rent a property and not evict. So yeah, they see council positively, and it will be very useful if council would have more power and more resources for helping tenants.
Thanks, Adriana. There's another one here. This one's from Jenny Houlihan. An interesting one about the representation question. So Jenny's wondering why, or if you could say a little bit more about why tenants have the view that only tenants can speak for tenants, and is there a kind of suspicion around charities on the basis that they're uniformly homeowners and maybe don't know what it's like to be a tenant, or a little bit more about that self-representation question.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. There was clearly the lived experience. Some tenants were saying that only if you are a private tenant, you can understand the stress that disrepair or eviction has on you, and repeated eviction. There was also organizations were welcome, but participants said, without being negative, there is not their role to help tenants first. For instance, shelter is made to give advice for in any housing situation. You know, tenants are just one part of the whole shelter sphere of work. And councils were approached when it was felt that are pro-tenant politically. For instance, there were tenants who said, we are really looking at any councillor to see their policies regarding to renting. So some councils were more likely to be approached than others, depending on how their political orientation was felt. Some, for instance, in non-tenant councils, they prefer to approach the media. There were 4 renters who approached the media rather than the council.
Thank you, Adriana. And we have a couple more here as well. The first is from Jamela, which is about methodology. Have you explained how you selected and accessed the participants? Did you use a particular database? Yeah, no, that's always a big challenge for when it comes to qualitative research, recruiting participants.
Yeah. So I was lucky in a way, because that was my 3rd project with private tenants. And in the first project, I had bigger problem of recruitment until I discovered the tenants group, some tenants group Facebook communities, which were related actually to some tenant unions group. So that was my main source of recruitment. I tweeted, but I don't think that was as useful as putting the advert in these tenant communities online. And in these communities, interestingly, there are not only the low income, because as you could see, my sample was really, the financial situation of participants was spread from very difficult to comfortable.
And one from Rachel Walsh: did you discern from the responses a strong or limited understanding on the part of tenants of their statutory rights?
This being activist tenants, as I call them, they were quite knowledgeable on their rights. And for instance, they mentioned that they did not receive a property inventory, and they knew that that will make Section 21, which is the eviction note in England, illegal. So they were very knowledgeable, I would say, and they also asked for advice. 3 of my participants were giving advice on these tenant Facebook groups, of which 2, I think they had a legal profession.
Okay, interesting. Great questions there for Adriana. I'll throw it open now for the last part of this morning's seminar. Thanks for all the wonderful papers. And yeah, open up the discussion to give people an opportunity to ask questions that are either directed at all our panelists, or maybe to return to one of the earlier papers if they like. So and while we wait for some questions to come in there, I might ask a question for Bridgette and Sarah, if I can. I think one of the things that's interesting is that, we're kind of seeing different ways in which the landlord-tenant relationship is being framed here, the kind of informal power dynamics that's came across really strongly from Bronwyn's paper, and then the the kind of politicization of the relationship that we see in Adriana's paper, and then of course Sarah and Bridgette's paper looking at it more in that kind of legal and quasi-juridical context. And from Adriana's paper, that sense comes across of tenants wanting much tighter regulation and much tighter protections. My question is really about, to what extent a dispute resolution type model or a hearing type model, to what extent is it appropriate for a model like that, or possible for it, to deliver much stronger protections for tenants? So if such a model is based on the idea of simply adjudicating on disputes between two parties that are, you know, framed as equal parties in a contractual relationship, can that type of model ever deliver maybe a more rights-based approach or a more social justice-based approach, or do we need to look to an entirely different way of framing the relationship between landlord and tenant in policy and regulation?
I don't know, Sarah, did you want to answer?
I think that's something Bridget and I have discussed quite a lot and kind of debated, I guess, together. And we have arrived at this sort of system that we think would work better for tenants, where the landlord was possibly excluded from some of the discussions around rent arrears. But yeah, we have debated about whether it would be better to have a system with lawyers and would that enable tenants to have greater power. But then that does also provide a more intimidating system, which I guess Bridgette has more experience on, that kind of civil disputes and how that would work. So
yeah, I mean, some of it, what we've talked about as well, is about the kind of different theories which are underlying how the adjudicators are approaching it. So they've got this kind of strong, you know, property rights kind of framework going on, but they're also receiving all the media, you know, about the housing crisis and sustaining tenancy, so that you can even see within their own decision making, I'm not sure they're quite sure and that, you know, the statute doesn't line up very well with the current kind of policy, is, you know, one of the findings from our paper. So then we were sort of thinking, well, how do you kind of put all these things together? And I mean, one way I've been sort of thinking about it for a while is, you know, using a kind of more therapeutic model of jurisprudence. So, you know, the idea that you have from drug and alcohol courts and things like that, where you use the court as a sentinel event where you then wrap services around people. And so that's what we'd kind of been toying with. And that's quite a big trend in New Zealand. We've got this sort of new policy in the district court that brings that idea across the whole court. So there's kind of potentially a moment to at least think about or develop or experiment with something which is a bit more creative. And the mediation space potentially allows you to do more of that, but instead it's become this very transactional thing using mediation's confidentiality. So there's all sorts of interesting kind of cross currents, and I'm not sure, because, you know, the Americans have got quite a judicial system and representation, and that's got a lot of problems as well. So I don't think there's a clear answer.
Yeah, there's the potential with these sustainable tenancies policies and those wraparound support systems for the tribunal to be more, more of a support sort of system for people in crisis than sort of a factory for eviction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. It's really interesting, because tenancy protection has become a much bigger part, I think, of the discussion here in Ireland in terms of how services are delivered to tenants. But it's very interesting to think about that potentially being embedded within the dispute resolution process itself. A great question here from Paddy Gray. Thanks, Paddy. And this is for all the panelists. Could I ask each member of the panel to discuss one positive outcome they would like to see post-COVID regarding the PRS? And so I might, if I don't know, if it's okay, I'd ask each of the panelists maybe to respond to that in the same order you spoke in, if it is something you would like to respond to. Bronwyn, could I start with you? It's going to be hard to pick just one, I'm thinking.
if someone wants to go first, I can have a think about it. I'd appreciate it, but
Adriana is keen to jump in. So do you want to go ahead, Adriana?
Yeah, I would like to go ahead because in my research, I noticed one thing which I could not communicate it in the paper. So in the first two research on private tenants, where I recruited tenants from the same source, main source, of course, the research was framed differently, but we asked them, what do you think the government should do and what do you think you need that your property will become home? And their demands were quite muted. I would say explained by the concept of social violence. They didn't dare to ask. When I asked them now, because the governments took this exceptional measure, I think that created a hope, and tenant demands are now more vocal and stronger. So I think, in my opinion, this is one of the COVID good outcome. And I hope the watering down of this measure will not go to the previous situation. Also, I'm not more optimistic than my participants either.
Thanks, Adriana. Bronwyn, are you indicating that you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I'm okay now.
Great,
look,
thank you.
I mean, it's really, it's probably going to be a really simple kind of, like, everyone says this, but realistically, more investment in social housing, because the more research I do into the private rental sector, the more skeptical I am about it being a viable option, particularly for the most vulnerable people. So in Australia, we have, in replace of social housing, we're starting to offer rent assistance, or it's been in place for a while. But, you know, there's all types of lawful and unlawful discrimination that occurs in the private rental sector, even during the search and application for a private rental property. So those in a high demand private rental sector, who is missing out and where are they going if there's no social housing, for a start? And then those are the types of people that are struggling the most while living in private rental accommodation, because, you know, they're the types of people that aren't able to advocate for themselves. And then I think on top of all of that, you have a landlord who is also financially invested in something, who wants their rent to be paid on time. And it's just not, and doesn't understand that. I don't think particularly, I mean, I can only speak for Australian research, but doesn't really understand that their investment is a risk the same way you would invest maybe in shares or something. I think that there's still this mindset that somehow it's not as big, we're investing in property is not as big a risk, but it is. And so it's really like a complex issue. And the other thing is holding property managers or like real estate agents more accountable for their behaviour, because they really get away with a lot, like in Australia. And I just think that needs to be held accountable for some of that stuff. And I'd love to do some more research into that, but I think it's really hard demographic to access. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks very much, Bronwyn. And then Bridgette and Sarah, I don't know if you would like to respond to that question from Paddy.
Sarah can do that for us. Yeah.
I think that for me, and I guess if I'm speaking for you, Bridgette, too, during our lockdown, when they put that moratorium out on evictions and put in rent restrictions, it was for the kind of public health interest. It was about containing the virus. And I would love to see that kind of value of home during the pandemic, when everyone was at home. We were valuing people maintaining their tenancies and having a rent that wasn't constantly increasing beyond the ability to pay. If we could somehow, in a utopian world, shift to that, focus more on the use value rather than the exchange or a profit value of home, I think that would be really wonderful. Yeah, that's what I would be interested in seeing. yeah, just how quickly countries have been to adopt those moratoriums on eviction and rent rises in a time of public health crisis, and we have this housing crisis going on now. So seeing sort of a shift in values.
Thank you, Sarah. A question from Lydia Reid here, which I think is for all panelists as well, but does refer particularly to England and Wales, which I don't know, maybe Adriana, you're particularly well suited to respond to. What are your thoughts what are your thoughts regarding the effects of abolishing no-fault evictions, which is on the cards in England and Wales? Do you think it will make a difference to tenant security of tenure, or will it result in unlawful evictions? That's a really interesting question, because we have seen quite a lot of reform in policy in the private rental sector. Certainly in Ireland, there's been a huge amount of new legislation or amendments to legislation in recent years, and I know that's the case too in Scotland and to some extent in England and Wales. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, Adriana.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and certainly would make a change. That's why tenants union organization are all for it and demand it. It's true that unlawful eviction will still go on. For instance, in my sample of 60 participants, 2 were unlawfully evicted during the COVID period. However, we know that security of tenure is not just how it is in law, isn't it? It's how we feel it. And because in Scotland, this has been abolished some years ago, in 2017, isn't it? It gives participants a kind of peace. So it is very good to happen. And I noticed, if you look at the England and Scottish tenants' demands, now Scottish demands are more oriented to make eviction, to tighten even more the clauses for eviction, because as long as you can evict for a property to be sold, the tenant is still not secure enough. And one participant, for instance, argued for tenants not to have the right to move in their property if needed, because they can rent like everybody else, and that maybe also make them more sensitive to what a tenant is. So yes, my answer is definitively, let's sign any petition for Section 21 to be abolished in England.
Yeah. Thanks, Adriana. That's definitely something I'd agree wholeheartedly with. We do have I think we have another question coming there, but I might just return to one of the ones from your presentation, Bronwyn, that we didn't get around to earlier on, if I may. And this one's from Jamila, who says, apart from the threat of eviction, what was the most significant aspect of the life of the tenants that they felt compromised their autonomy or sense of well-being? So apart from the threat of evictions.
I would say it really depended on the tenant. I think the inability to make changes to the rental property. So even since the time of my interview, so when I interviewed my participants, they weren't even allowed to put hooks in their walls to hang a picture. So it was really strict, and that has changed. So they weren't allowed to have pets. That's sort of loosening in Australia as well, and things like that. So I think those kinds of issues. And then the other one probably was mobility. So tenants who, so not just the threat of evictions, but the threat having to just move unexpectedly. I don't know, maybe I'm saying eviction, maybe that's what you mean. But, you know, for not that they've just been kicked out kind of thing, but just even in their own, I'm trying to think. Sorry. So yeah, but just the inability to the inability to hold on to possessions because they knew the cost of moving and the hassles around moving for some participants. So some participants actually just wouldn't. They just wouldn't unpack boxes. They wouldn't invest in furniture. They wouldn't, they wouldn't buy bulky, heavy furniture because of that like high level of mobile life. I know that that's around evictions, but tied into that, related to their inability then to make a home.
Yeah.
And that was probably affected them most significantly.
Thanks a million, Bronwyn. Yeah, certainly something I've come across as well in my own research with tenants. It comes across very strongly. I was interviewing a tenant just earlier in the week who talked about I asked them explicitly if they felt at home where they lived, and they talked about it as being just another stepping stone. So that sense of being kind of always, in a sense, on the move as a renter on some level. This is a question from Aideen. Oh, sorry, Adriana, did you indicate you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that on the other output of my research, which I haven't presented today, the changing sense of home of tenants, the sample was divided roughly in 3 parts. So a third, about 20 tenants, felt that property quality becomes worse when you see it all the time and affected them strongly. Even so, there was eviction ban, so that became even worse than before. The other third, so about 20 participants, but remember 10 moved for better housing quality during the COVID pandemic. They felt a bit more inclined in even putting plants in the garden, buying their own bookshelves, even so they didn't ask for landlord permission, but that ambiguity, I'm engaging in homemaking, but I know I might need to leave, was there anymore. Yeah, so that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Adriana. I'm just going to now go to a question from Aideen Hayden. Hi, Aideen. And she's asking about the suitability of sector for low-income households. And more specifically, our question is if the panel has a view on emerging intermediate tenures, for example, affordable rental. And I think what's meant there is intermediate tenures between private renting and social housing, perhaps, which are tenures which are available maybe to a wider variety of households than traditional social housing, but which are maybe non-market or not entirely market driven. So I know in Ireland there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the incoming, what we call here, the cost rental model, which will be a kind of intermediate tenure, as Aideen is describing it, and will be a new tenure for our housing system. So that's a question for the panel as a whole, and I just see if any of you would like to respond to it. Adriana?
Yeah,
Thanks.
I think any measure that would help affordability will be appreciated along the income spectrum, because rents are very high for low income, but they are also quite high for medium or higher income. But I think these new possibilities, like a more affordable subsector, should still have enough choice, geographically and like that, because tenants are mobile, most not because they want to be mobile, but because of labor market being so precarious. So yes, a more affordable private intermediary sector, in my opinion, it's very good as long as it's sizable. so that mobility can occur at the choice of tenant.
Thank you, Adriana.
I mean, sorry, in relation to that question, I think that there's always going to be some people that need some flexibility around housing as well. But what we're seeing in Australia is that the people on lower incomes are competing with people on middle and higher incomes to find rental housing, because those people are wanting the lower income houses and they're seen as more desirable because they want to save to enter into home ownership. And so in terms of a long-term housing plan, for any income pretty much, maybe if you're high income, private renting is just not, it's not a viable option. And that's why people want to be homeowners, like in Australia at least. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Bronwyn. I might return then just to a question from, I think it was from Richard Waldron, which was originally in relation to your question, your presentation, Bronwyn, I believe, but it might be something that others want to respond to as well. And it's about the divergent experiences of tenants in terms of income. So did you find that there was a difference in experiences in terms of high or low income tenants? Maybe not so relevant for Bridgette and Sarah, because I presume if you're in the tribunal for rent arrears, you're very likely a low income. But yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of accessing housing access, definitely. So the number one thing tenants like, and the number one things property managers look for, other than a good rental history, is ability to pay for a rental property. So income is a huge factor in even securing a rental property. Once you're in the market, income allows you to move easily. You can hire someone to help you move if you need to. You can get boxes, you can, it affords you. So if you are evicted, the stress around that eviction isn't as severe if you've got a higher income. And then on top of that, but then there were also participants who I had, who were on lower incomes, who enjoyed the nomadic lifestyle of renting, and they really lent into that. How that will go. So I had one participant that stands out in particular. So a lot of those participants were single, they didn't have children, they were younger, and they were men. The one participant he was an older man. He's like, I'm just going to be nomadic for the rest of my life. I'm never going to settle down. I wonder how that will go for him when he's 85 and he's still renting and he's got to move every 6 months, and that sort of stuff as well. So yeah, but definitely income plays a big part in mobility.
If I could add, Meg, in my research with the 60 tenants, the only relevant, not statistical, relationship between participants' income was that with their overall renting experience. But the relationship was weakened, and it was weakened once methodologically, because I asked about the subjective financial situation, very difficult, just getting by, and that one. The second was because there is high variation in each submarket of the sector. So as Bronwyn said, low income, I have had good experiences once or twice, but higher income also had terrible experiences. Only 11 participants considered their whole renting history has always been positive. And of course, the relationship, it's also diminished somehow because people have different expectations. And so it comes into it, this subjectivity of how you judge your, but leaving that apart, the low income are more likely to live in dire condition, isn't it? And higher income can afford to move and find better places.
Thanks, Adriana. Sarah or Bridgette, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that question. As I said, I'm not sure it's as relevant to your presentation.
Yeah, as part of our work, we did about 38 interviews with tenants who'd been evicted. So some of those people were on a higher income and went on to buy a house. But what came out of that was that trauma of losing your home was quite similar. The ability to cope after you lost your private rental was different, but that initial just kind of shock and trauma and sense of injustice, I guess, was similar no matter what people's incomes were. Yeah, and people on a higher income also seem slightly more likely to take cases to the tribunal rather than just to kind of move it along.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, I mean, I just, by way of kind of conclusion, you know, I think it's one of the things that emerges really clearly from looking at these presentations together is that the kind of complex relationships between landlords and tenant that can bedevil attempts to regulate the sector are embedded in the market structures, the nature of the market, embedded in legislative or regulatory structures and how they frame that relationship, and also embedded in maybe the cultural context around norms and values in terms of home, which obviously means that, you know, these issues are not easy to address because they're deep structural issues. So, you know, it's a huge challenge. But, you know, on the other hand, I do feel both in the literature and in terms of the policy and political debate here in Ireland that there's an increasing kind of consensus that the issues are deeply structural, and we need more kind of systemic level transformation within the housing system if we're to overcome some of the issues around housing inequality, which I think is enormously positive, especially in the light of Adriana's presentation and the potential for tenants themselves to lead change in this area. So with that said, I'd just like to thank once again all our panelists today for some fantastic papers, and also to everybody who joined in today. And there was loads of questions coming in there. I did my best to get to as many of them as possible, but I really appreciate everybody being here today. There will be a recording of this available, and I will also liaise with the panelists after this around making the presentation slides available. So thanks once again, everyone, especially our panelists, and enjoy the rest of your day or your night if you're in the Southern Hemisphere.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Michael. See you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.